6. The Communist trial in Cologne. Since the arrests which had taken place in May, 1851, Marx had closely followed the course of the preliminary investigations. But as they were repeatedly held up owing to the lack of any objective basis for an indictment, as even the official prosecutor was compelled to admit, there was not much to be done. All that could be proved against the arrested men was that they were members of a secret propaganda organization, and for this the Code Penal provided no punishment. However, the king insisted that his nominee, Stieber, should be given a chance to show his mettle and provide the Prussian public with the much-desired consummation of a discovered conspiracy and punished conspirators. And Stieber himself was too good a patriot not to execute the will of his hereditary ruler and king. He began his task in a fitting fashion by instigating an act of robbery. One of his tools broke open and rifled the writing desk of a man named Oswald Dietz, who had been secretary to Willisch's organization. As an astute agent provocateur, Stieber realized that the recklessness of this organization opened up prospects of success for his own edifying task such as the Marx Party would never have offered. With the assistance of stolen documents and with the aid rendered to him on the eve of the Bonapartist coup d'état by the French authorities, Stieber manufactured the so-called Franco-German plot in Paris, and in February, 1852, this led to the conviction of a number of unfortunate German workers by the Paris courts, which sentenced them to various terms of imprisonment. However, what Stieber did not succeed in doing was establishing any connection between his Paris plot and the accused in Cologne. For all his cunning, the Franco-German plot did not offer him even the shadow of a proof which could be used in Cologne. In the meantime, the differences between the Marx Party and the Willich-Schapper Party became still sharper. Willich still made common cause with Kinkel, and the latter's return from America caused all the squabbles amongst the exiles to flare up anew, so that in the spring and summer of 1852 the tension between the two organizations was acute. Kinkel had not secured the 20,000 thaler which was to have been the backbone of the National Revolutionary loan, but he had obtained about half of it. And now the question of what was to be done with the money developed into one over which the democratic fugitives not only racked their brains but also began to break each other's heads. In the end £1,000 sterling was deposited with the Westminster Bank as an earnest for the first provisional government, the remainder of the sum collected having been expended on the journey and for administration costs. The deposited sum never served its intended purpose, but 15 years later the foolishness came to a fairly satisfactory end when it assisted the press of the German social democracy over its initial difficulties. Whilst the tumult and the shouting surged around this Nibelungen treasure, Marx and Engels made sketches of the heroes of the battle, but unfortunately the manuscripts have not been preserved. They were persuaded to do so by a Hungarian colonel named Banya, who presented himself to them with a holograph authorization from Kossuth appointing him police president of the Hungarian emigration. Although in reality the man was a common spy and always at the service of the highest bidder, he was exposed by Marx and Engels because instead of handing the manuscript to the Berlin publishers for whom it was intended, Banya gave it to the Prussian police. Marx nailed down the rogue's knavery instantly in a signed declaration which was published in the New York Criminal Zeitung, but he was unable to obtain the return of his manuscript, which has never turned up since. If the Prussian government had hoped to use it as material in the Cologne trial, it must have been disappointed. In its desperation at the lack of proofs against the accused, the government caused the postponement of the public trial from one assize to the next, thereby increasing the suspense of an eager public to concert pitch until in October, 1852, it simply had to raise the curtain and let the performance begin. Not all the determined perjuries of the police agents were sufficient to establish any connection between the accused and the Franco-German plot, i.e., with a plot which was fabricated by the police whilst the accused were in prison and in an organization of which they were not only not members, but even opponents. In the end, therefore, Stieber, in his desperation, produced the original minute book of the Marx Party containing a chronological series of minutes describing meetings at which Marx and his comrades were alleged to have discussed their nefarious plans for world revolution. This minute book was an infamous forgery scraped together by the agents provocateurs Charles Fleury and Wilhelm Hirsch under the direction of a police officer named Greif. At first glance the precious document bore all the marks of forgery and its contents were simply idiotic. But Stieber counted on the stupidity of his carefully sifted bourgeois jurymen and kept a close watch over the mail in order to prevent explanations and enlightenment coming from London. However, Stieber's wretched plan failed owing to the energy and circumspection with which Marx countered it, although he was ill-prepared for a long and grueling struggle. On the 8th of September he wrote to Engels, "My wife is ill, little Jenny is ill. Lincoln has a sort of nervous fever, and I can't call in the doctor because I have no money to pay him. For about 8 or 10 days we have all been living on bread and potatoes, and it is now doubtful whether we shall be able to get even that. I have written nothing for Dana because I have not had the money to buy newspapers. The best thing that could possibly happen now would be for the landlady to throw us out, for in that case I should have the weight of £22 back rent off my mind. But I doubt whether she will be so considerate. And then we are indebted to the baker, the milkman, the grocer, the greengrocer and the butcher. How on earth am I to get out of this devilish mess? During the past week or so I have borrowed a few shillings and even pence from workers. It was terrible, but it was absolutely necessary or we should have starved." This was the desperate situation in which Marx was compelled to take up the struggle with powerful enemies. But in it both he and his wife forgot their domestic troubles. Victory was still in the balance when Frau Marx wrote to an American friend, "All the proofs of the forgery have had to be provided from here and my husband has had to work all day and even far into the night. And then we have had to copy everything 6 or 7 times and send it to Germany by various ways, over Frankfurt, Paris, etc. Because all letters to my husband and all his letters to Germany are opened and confiscated. The whole affair has now been reduced to a struggle between the police on the one hand and my husband on the other, and my husband is being made responsible for everything, even the conduct of the trial. You must excuse my confusion, but I have also had some part in the intrigue, and I have copied and copied until my fingers ached. Whole lists of business addresses and pseudo-business letters have just arrived from Worth and Engels as a cloak for the safe sending of the documents, etc. Our house has been turned into a regular office. 2 or 3 are writing, others are running messages, and the remainder are engaged in scraping pennies together in order that we can all continue to exist and provide proof of the most shameful scandal the official world has ever perpetrated. And all the time my 3 lively children are singing and whistling, occasionally earning a severe rebuke from their father. What a life! Marx won the victory and Stieber's forgery was exposed even before the trial so that the public prosecutor was compelled to abandon the wretched book. However, the public victory sealed the fate of the accused. The 5 weeks' proceedings revealed such a mass of infamies committed in part by the highest authorities in the Prussian state that the acquittal of the accused would have meant the conviction of the state in the eyes of the whole world. To spare the state this humiliation the jurymen were prepared to besmirch their honor and violate their consciences, and they therefore found 7 of the 11 accused guilty of attempted high treason. The cigar-maker Rosa, the author Burgess, and the journeyman tailor Nuth-Jung were sentenced to 6 years' imprisonment in a fortress each. The worker Eve, the chemist Otto and the former barrister Becker received 5 years each, whilst the journeyman tailor Lessner received 3 years. The clerk Erhardt and the 3 physicians Daniels, Jacobi and Klein were all acquitted. However, Daniels died a few years later of consumption contracted during the 18 months he had been imprisoned awaiting trial. In a moving letter his wife sent his last greetings to Marx, who mourned his death deeply. The other victims of this shameful trial survived Daniels by many years and some of them even worked their way back into the bourgeois world, for instance, Bergers, who was elected to the Reichstag as a progressive, and Becker, who later became Lord Mayor of Cologne and a member of the Prussian upper house and whose highly patriotic attitude on all occasions won him the good graces of the government and the court. Amongst the convicted men who remained loyal to the proletarian flag were Nuth-Jung and Rosa, both of whom played an active part in the beginnings of the renewed working class movement, and Lessner, who survived both Marx and Engels and became one of their most devoted comrades in exile. After the Cologne Communist trial, the Communist League dissolved and its example was soon followed by Willisch's organization. Willich himself emigrated to America and during the Civil War he won well-earned fame as a general in the Northern Army, whilst Schapper returned penitently to his old comrades. However, Marx was unwilling to permit the Prussian government to enjoy the miserable victory it had won at the Cologne Assizes, and he determined to pillory it in the eyes of the world. To this end he prepared the revelations at the trial for publication in Switzerland and, if possible, also in America. Writing on the 7th of December to friends in America he declared, "You will appreciate the humor of the pamphlet more I think when I tell you that its author is practically interned owing to the lack of adequate covering for his feet and his behind. and that in addition his family was and still is threatened with really horrible misery. This too is in part a result of the preceding weeks I was compelled to devote all my energies to defending the party against the machinations of the government, instead of earning a living. Not only that, but the trial has turned the German booksellers against me completely, and I had hoped to come to some arrangement with them for the publication of my book on political economy. However, on the 11th of December Scabelitz Jr., who had undertaken to publish the book, wrote to Marx from Bâle informing him that he was already going through the first galleys. I am convinced that the book will create a tremendous sensation because it is a masterpiece. Scabelitz proposed to print 2,000 copies and fix the price at 10 silver groschen per copy because he reckoned that at least part of the edition would be confiscated. Unfortunately, the whole of the edition was confiscated when it was about to be sent into the interior from the little frontier village in Baden, where it had been stored for about 6 weeks. On the 10th of March the bad news was reported to Engels with the bitter words, "Such misfortunes threaten to rob one of all further encouragement to write. Always to be working Paul Auro Ida Prus." It proved impossible to discover how the leakage had occurred, and the suspicion which Marx had at first harbored against the publisher turned out to be baseless. Scabelitz even offered to distribute the 500 copies he had retained in Switzerland, although little seems to have come of this. The affair had a bitter sequel for Marx when 3 months later not Scabelitz but his partner Amberger demanded compensation for the printing costs in the sum of 424 francs. Fortunately, however, the failure in Switzerland was in part compensated by success in America. Though naturally the effect of the revelations concerning the Cologne trial in America was not so disturbing to the Prussian government as it would have been in Europe, the New England Zeitung, which was published in Boston, printed the revelations, and Engels had 440 special copies printed at his own expense. With Lassalle's assistance he proposed to distribute them in the Rhine province. Frau Marx corresponded with Lassalle on the point, and the latter showed himself zealous enough. But unfortunately the correspondence does not reveal whether the plan was carried out successfully or not. The revelations found a lively echo in the German-American press, and Willich in particular came forward against the work. This caused Marx to write a short reply to him entitled "The Night of the High-Souled Conscience," but today it is hardly worthwhile to lift the veil of oblivion which has long since fallen on it. As is always the case in such controversies, sins were committed by both sides, and as the victor Marx gladly refrained from triumphing over the vanquished. Referring to the first years of the emigration period, he declared in 1860 that its most brilliant vindication was a comparison between its history and the parallel history of the bourgeois governments and of bourgeois society. With very few exceptions the fugitives could be accused of nothing worse than having harbored illusions which were more or less justified by the conditions of the day, and of having committed follies which necessarily arose out of the unusual circumstances in which the emigrants unexpectedly found themselves. When he prepared a second edition of the Revelations for publication in 1875, he at first hesitated as to whether he should delete the passages dealing with the Willich-Schapper faction. But finally he let them stand, feeling that any mutilation of the text might appear like tampering with an historic document, but he added, "The violent events of a revolution leave a disturbing heritage in the minds of those who take part in it, and in particular in the minds of those who are hounded into exile away from their homes. This mental disturbance affects even capable men for a longer or shorter period and makes them, so to speak, irresponsible. They fail to understand the meaning of events, and they refuse to see that the form of the movement has changed. The result is that they indulge in conspiracies and romantic revolutionism which compromise both them and the cause they have at heart. This is the explanation of the errors of Schapper and Willich. In the American Civil War Willich demonstrated that he was something more than a weaver of fantastic projects, whilst Schapper, who was a lifelong pioneer of the working class movement, recognized and admitted his momentary errors soon after the communist trial in Cologne. Many years later, the day before he died, Schapper referred with caustic irony to the folly of the early emigrant days. On the other hand, the circumstances in which the revelations were originally issued explain the bitterness with which the involuntary helpers of the common enemy were attacked. To lose one's head at a moment of crisis is a crime against the party, and it demands public expiation. These were words of wisdom at a time when it was still thought more important to maintain a good tone than to establish clarity on matters of principle. Once the battle was fought and the victory won, Marx was the last man to harbor petty rancor. Answering some brusque remarks of Freili Grot in 1850 on the doubtful and degraded elements which had found their way into the League, he admitted more than he need have done when he declared, Storms always raise a certain amount of dirt and dust, and a revolutionary period does not smell of attar of roses. It is clear that occasionally one is spattered with all sorts of muck. It is impossible to be too particular at such a moment. But he was justified in adding, however, if one considers the tremendous efforts of the official world against us, the ransacking of the code penal against us, the slanderous tongues of the democracy of stupidity, which has never been able to forgive us for displaying greater intelligence and greater strength of character than it did itself, and the history of all other parties, one must come to the conclusion that in this 19th century our party is distinguished above all by its purity. When the Communist League ceased to exist, the last threads which connected Marx with public life in Germany were broken, and from now on exile, the home of the good, became his home too.